Well, today we are going to talk about St. Thomas Aquinas and his famous 5 arguments that he says prove the existence of God. Right? So that would be something. For the price of community college, you could get not just one, but 5 different arguments that all prove that God exists. That would be something, right? So that's what's going to happen today. So tiny little bit of background on St. Thomas Aquinas. As his name implies, he is a Catholic saint. He lives in the 1200s AD during what is commonly known as the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages. Right? He's one of the most important intellectual lights of the Middle Ages period. Right. One of the reasons these arguments are historically and intellectually important is because these arguments don't just take it that you can sort of logic your way into realizing that God exists. Right? Logic is involved, don't get me wrong. But all of Aquinas' arguments here begin by observing some fact about nature, some fact about the world, right? And arguing that, hey, that fact about the world can only be explained if there is a God, right? Now, as a little caveat before we go into this, the God that Aquinas ends up proving exists in most of these arguments doesn't to everybody seem necessarily like the God of the Bible, right? This was not lost on people in Aquinas' own era. A lot of people looked at his arguments and said, well, yeah, okay, maybe that argument proves something exists, but is it necessary? You say it's God, but is it necessarily Jesus, right? The God of the Bible. So anyway, just a little warning before we get into that, and I'll say a little bit more about that later. So Aquinas offers 5 ways to know that God exists, all beginning with an observation about the world. Right. So let's begin with the first one. The first one is the unmoved mover. Give me just a second. Okay. So for Aquinas' first argument, the argument from the unmoved mover, Aquinas says, well, look around you. And what you see that there are a variety of objects in the universe. Some of them are in motion, and some of them are just laying around at rest. Right? Now, the things that we see laying around at rest, they can be put into motion. Right? But they can only be put into motion by a previous mover. Right? So the pen that's laying, or the marker that's laying there on the table, it only is put into motion if I come along, if something like me comes along and flicks it, right? Something that moves puts it into motion, right? Now, take for instance the moon, right? You look up at the moon is moving around the Earth, right? How did it start moving around the Earth? Well, our best astronomical theories say this, that a long time ago, about 4 billion years ago, some large asteroid or something like an asteroid hit into the Earth, and it sent off this big chunk of stuff up into orbit, and that stuff was captured in the gravity of the Earth, and it coalesced into the moon, right? Now, so the moon was put into motion by something striking the Earth and knocking some junk off into orbit, right? Well, why stop there? You might say, well, no, wait a second. What was this asteroid that struck the Earth? Where did that come from? How did that get into motion? Well, that probably came from some sort of asteroid field in the early solar system, right? The asteroids are all circling around the sun, but they're also, as they're doing this, they're kind of bumping into each other, and one of them bumps into one in a certain way and sends it flying off on a trajectory towards Earth, right? So the moon is put into motion by the asteroid hitting the Earth. The asteroid that hit the Earth is bumped into motion by a previous asteroid. Don't just stop there. the other asteroid, how did that get bumped into motion? Well, you see what's happening here is we have a regress. We have a regress of movers. For everything that's in motion that was previously at rest, we can ask ourselves, well, what motion came along to put that thing in motion, right? And we can do this for a very long time. Now, the question becomes, can we do this forever? Can we just say that this regress goes back to infinity? There's just an infinity of previous movers back throughout time. Aquinas thinks no. There can't be an infinity of movers. And his argument here is real simple. He says, well, if there were an infinity of previous movers, that means there was no first mover. And if there were no first mover, there could be no second mover. And then there could be no third mover. And so there could not be a chain of movers, right? So, well, what's the other, besides an infinity of movers, what's the other possibility? Aquinas says, well, the other possibility is that if we trace this regress back far enough, we're eventually going to arrive at something that is itself a mover. It moves things, but it is unmoved. There is no previous mover that set it into motion. It is the cause of motion, but not the result of any motion, right? This would be an unmoved mover. And what could something like this be? Well, Aquinas says, this is God, right? So, okay, let's parse this argument out. The unmoved mover argument goes like this. Some things are in motion. Everything that is put into motion is only moved by a previous mover. Either there is an infinite regress of movers, or there was a first unmoved mover. An infinite regress is impossible. Therefore, there must be a first unmoved mover. This is God. Now, you might, if you've listened to the Course Objectives worksheet lecture, you might have noticed that there's a valid argument for lurking here. Notice the presence of the word either, right? Either this or this. Not this, therefore this. Disjunctive syllogism, right? So there's a disjunctive syllogism in here. Anyway, now it's common at this point for many people, including students of mine, to raise a hand and say, well, but I mean, just because something moves everything and causes the initial movement of the universe, it doesn't really seem like it's, God in the sense that we pray to God to help us with our lives. I mean, that first mover could be some sort of weird, chemical reaction or some sort of very weird physical thing that just sort of, blew up into existence, right? And that doesn't seem like God in the personal sense. It doesn't seem like God in the God that you pray to or that cares about your life or even has the ability to care about individual lives, right? As I said earlier in my, my warning about these arguments, yes, not everybody is convinced that this particular argument and a couple of the other ones that follow indicate the God of the Bible. And that was controversial even in Aquinas' own time. So, okay, so that's the first argument, the argument from the unmoved mover. Okay, Aquinas' second argument that God must exist is called the first cause argument, and a lot of people point out that it is virtually identical to the first argument. At the very least, I think it's safe to say that if you have the second argument, you probably don't need the one about motion. But the one about motion, think of it as sort of the training wheels. That's the kind of easiest one to understand. And once you're thinking, oh, okay, yeah, motion, I get that, and things at rest and things put into motion. So now we can move to a more general kind of argument, a little more abstract version of that argument. And that's the first cause argument. right? The first cause argument doesn't have to do with motion exactly, but it's more generally about causes, right? There is some reason or some set of reasons why something exists rather than something else, right? For everything that is the case in the universe, every state of affairs, there is some reason or some set of reasons why that thing exists or is the case rather than something else. Give an example of that. I'm Jason Bollinger. Hi, I'm here today. Why am I here today? Well, there are a variety of ways that we might answer that question, but the most literal way to answer the question, well, why is Jason here right now, is because my parents, John and Connie, sometime back in 1974, they shared a special hug, right? Sharing that hug at that time, at that particular time, at that particular place, resulted in me, right? Now, had that hug been shared a month earlier or a month later, my brother or sister, my big brother or sister or little brother or sister, would be here right now giving this lecture. It was destiny that one of us Bollingers would go into philosophy, no doubt. So yes, he or she would be here now, but I would not be, right? The existence of that other brother or sister is mutually exclusive of my own, right? If my mother had gotten pregnant a month earlier or a month later, I wouldn't be here right now, right? So there's a reason or a set of reasons why Jason is here right now and not somebody else, right? Now, we need not stop at my parents, right? We can say, well, okay, so John and Connie shared a special hug that resulted in Jason. How did John and Connie get here? And here's where we're going to have to get really uncomfortable for a second, because we can tell the same story, horrible as it seems, about my grandparents, right? They came together in a certain place, in a certain time, in a certain way, and the result of that coupling was my parents, right? Now, what we have here is we have certain kinds of causes, right? My grandparents caused my parents to be born. My parents caused me to be born. Now we can go back and say, well, what caused my grandparents to be born, and go talk about my great-grandparents and my great-great-grandparents and so on, right? Now, we have a regress, right? We have a backward sort of moving chain. And it makes sense at any point in the chain to ask, well, why are these people here, or why is this state of affairs here rather than something else? And then we can give some causes, some reasons, right? Now, once again, Aquinas, and he's going to use the same sort of machinery as he did in the previous argument. He said, okay, well, either there is an infinite regress of causes that just goes on back forever, or if we talk about causes, if we keep taking this chain of causes back far enough, we will eventually come to a first thing that is the cause of everything in the universe, but is itself uncaused. There is nothing that explains why that thing exists. That thing is just eternal, exists for all time, right? And it has always been the cause of everything, and it doesn't make any sense to ask, well, where did it come from? Because it's just there, right? So those are our two options. Either it's an infinite regress of causes, or eventually we will arrive at a first uncaused cause. Aquinas, for virtually the same reasons as in the first argument, he is going to dismiss the idea that there could be an infinite regress of causes. He says, well, if there were no first cause, there could be no second cause, and then no third cause, and so on. So that doesn't work. That doesn't explain anything, right? So his conclusion is, well, then, okay, that only leaves that there must be this first eternal uncaused cause. And you guessed it, it's God, right? So this breaks down this way. The first cause argument. Some things are caused, right? Anything that is caused is only caused by a previous cause. Either there is an infinite regress of causes, or there is a first uncaused cause. Aquinas then says an infinite regress is impossible, and therefore there must be a first uncaused cause, something that is the cause of everything in the universe, but is itself not caused to come into existence. Right? This, he says, is God. Now, it is only natural in response to this argument to say, now wait a second. You thought that you said that everything was caused, and then eventually you come down to something is uncaused. Why does it make sense to ask where God came from? Well, it's a very common objection to Aquinas' argument here, and he treads carefully. He never says that everything is caused. He says that some things are caused. At least some things are caused. We look around us and we see that everything that we can see around us, anyway, has some set of explanations for why it is the case, for why it exists and not something else in its place, right? So at the very least, some things are caused. Is it true that everything is caused? Well, that's the adventure here. That's what he wants to ask, right? And eventually he says, no, there has to be at least one uncaused cause, which is God. It doesn't technically make sense then to ask, well, where did God come from? Where did the uncaused cause come from? Because by definition, there could be no explanation for that. It is uncaused, right? Doesn't necessarily mean that the question, where did God come from, is meaningless or dumb. But Aquinas is going to sort of semantically maneuver around that one, right? Okay. Number 3. Next is Aquinas' argument from contingency. So before we go any further, let me explain a concept that he's going to make use of that comes up in philosophy and metaphysics, right? And that is the distinction between contingent beings and necessary beings, right? Or contingent things and necessary things. Something that is contingent could either exist or not exist, right? So like we talked about Jason, me, right? And we talked about how I do exist, but it could easily have been the case that my mother had gotten pregnant a month earlier or a month later, and or not at all, and that I didn't exist. So it's easy to imagine Jason not having existed, right? Further, so I am a contingent being. That is, I do exist, but I could have not existed, right? In the same way, my fictional big brother, I don't have a big brother, but I could have had a big brother, he's also contingent, right? He doesn't exist, but he could have existed, right? There's no law of nature, for instance, or no law of logic that prevents, arguably, my big brother from having existed. There's no law of nature or law of logic, arguably, that prevents Jason, or that means that Jason must have existed, right? So, anyway, so if you sort of get that idea of contingency, things that could have either existed or not have existed, right? The opposite of contingent is necessary, right? A non-contingent being is something, a necessary being could not possibly have not existed. It must exist, right? And now what Aquinas is going to do here is he is going to consider the fact that when we look around us, we see what appear to be contingent beings all around us. Everything that we see around us could have not existed, and in fact, at some point didn't exist. At some point in the future won't exist, right? Everything we see around us came into existence and it will eventually move out of existence. It's the definition of of being a contingent being, right? So the question that Aquinas wants to figure is that true of everything in the universe? is everything in the universe contingent? The alternative would be that there are things, or at least one thing, that is necessary, non-contingent, could not possibly have not existed, right? And if you think you know what that is, stop jumping ahead. So the argument from contingency goes this way, that many things we look around us, we see that many things are contingent, that is, they exist, but they could have not existed. And Aquinas observes that everything that is contingent at some point did not exist. Everything that's contingent at some point, it came into existence, and therefore, at some point, was not around. If we go back far enough, it wasn't here anymore, right? Everything in this room, if we go back a couple hundred years, nothing that's in this room would be here, right? If we go back a few billion years, the whole planet wouldn't be here, right? So it seems that everything we see around us at one point didn't exist, right? And Aquinas says, well, now that's a problem, because if everything is contingent, that is, if everything at some point in the past didn't exist, and it must be the case that everything, absolutely everything, if we go back far enough, didn't exist, that means at some point in the past there was nothing. I mean absolutely nothing. Not atoms, not quarks, not Higgs boson particles. There was absolutely nothing. It was emptier even than the vacuum of space, which is not really a vacuum. It is hiding all sorts of radiation, right? Forget that. Absolutely nada, nothing, right? And Aquinas thinks, well, if at some point there was absolutely nothing, there would still be nothing, because nothing comes from nothing. If at one point in the past there were absolutely nothing, there's no way that vast nothingness could have just, created something, right? So Aquinas says, well, then it must be the case that not everything is contingent, that there must be something that's been around forever, and that is the necessary thing that exists, that brings everything else into existence, right? That there is something that it is just simply not possible that this thing did not exist, because everything that we see around us owes its ultimate existence to this thing. Put that way, yet again, number 3 seems awfully similar to number 1 and 2, right? If you noticed that, congratulations. You're not the only one who's noticed that. But again, Aquinas is taking a lot of criticism over this. So anyway, Aquinas says, well, okay, if everything were contingent, then at one point there was nothing, and nothing comes from nothing, there would still be nothing. Therefore, there must be a non-contingent being, which is to say a necessary being, and you guessed it, this is God. He is the necessary thing that brings into existence the whole universe that we see around us. So, okay. This is the argument from contingency, number 3. Many things are contingent, Aquinas says, which is to say they could have not existed. I.e., by the way, is a Latin abbreviation that means which is to say, right? If you ever see I.e., that's what that means. Now you'll see it everywhere, particularly if you're reading this kind of literature. Number 2, everything that is contingent did not exist at one point. If everything were contingent, then at one point there was nothing, absolutely nothing. And if there were ever nothing, then there would still be nothing, right? Because nothing comes from nothing. Nothing begets nothing. Therefore, that's what that little line means. Therefore, there must be a necessary, which is to say non-contingent being. And this necessary being is God, Aquinas says. Okay, So let's pause for a second to go on a digression. By this point in the live lecture, almost certainly somebody has brought up the Big Bang Theory, not the sitcom, the actual scientific theory, the Big Bang Theory or quantum physics. And I want to say a little bit about modern cosmology, that is the modern science of studying the origins of the universe, right? And what they say and how that might inform some of the concepts that Aquinas is laying out here. So the relevance is this, that these first three arguments anyway, don't, as I've said, don't necessarily seem to point to the God of the Bible. They might just point to some eternally existing particle or some eternally existing physical stuff, right, that is going through various kinds of fluctuations and explosions and so on, right? And that fluctuation and explosion and different states of that fluctuation and explosion can explain the motion of the universe. It can explain the causes of the universe, and can explain why it is that just because everything appears to be contingent, there is at the root of the universe, the most basic level of the universe, there is some eternal stuff that's just kind of changing form, right? So, this often leads into a discussion of the Big Bang Theory, which is one of the the primary scientific explanation for how the current state of the universe came into being. The idea being that at some point way in the past, over 14 billion years ago, closer to 15 billion years ago, of course, that's just measuring by our standard time. I mean, there wasn't a sun yet, so it wasn't really a year, right? But anyway, standardizing time, this is about 15 billion years ago. Back then, everything that you see around you and everything you could possibly see, even with the strongest telescope, all that stuff was crammed into this space, this tiny, tiny little space, infinitely tiny and infinitely dense, right? Space, right? All the stuff in the universe crammed into this little particle, weird sort of particle thing. And the idea says that for some reasons that remain elusive to us and might necessarily forever be elusive, this particle underwent some sort of expansion, right? And this is the Big Bang. That all the matter that we see in the universe now was crammed into this little point, and that little point went and began expanding and spreading out at a pace that is unimaginably fast, right? And gets bigger and bigger and bigger in this unimaginably huge way, right? And that creates the universe we have today. I bring this up because the Big Bang Theory is one example of a way that you might be able to satisfy Aquinas's the demands of Aquinas's conclusions here, without necessarily saying anything about the God of the Bible or any sort of personal God in any sense. That could be. By the way, a lot of people, just a footnote for a footnote, a lot of people think of the Big Bang as sort of like just a standard explosion, like a grenade going off, right? And they think, well, okay, so what's the big deal about that? But it's actually a lot different than that. The Big Bang itself causes not just it doesn't just fling the matter. It actually creates time and space as it expands. So a grenade going off is just particles flying through space. But the Big Bang Theory is this weird explosion that creates time and space as it moves out. One way, and a better way to think about the Big Bang, a better way than the grenade, is a balloon blowing up. This metaphor is not perfect, and I know a lot of cosmologists really object to it because it's misleading in a few ways, but it is enlightening to a degree. So think of a balloon expanding, right? And that the universe, the physical universe, is at the outer edge of that expanding balloon, right? And if you think about it that way, that makes some physical facts about the universe make a lot of sense. At every point in the universe, if you take a telescope and you look out, everything is moving away from you, right? Everything in every direction that you look is moving away from you. And how can that be? It's like you're the center of the universe. Well, it's not exactly that. It's like, think of the expanding of the balloon. If you're sitting at one point on the balloon, and as it's expanding, then as you turn around and look, it seems like everything's moving away from you, right? And the idea here is not that the universe is expanding through some kind of space, but rather that more and more space is being created between things, and everything's getting further apart. Even if we're standing still, we're getting further apart because the space itself between all points is expanding, right? So anyway, I find my students are sometimes a little interested in that kind of stuff, and it's remotely related to this. So, okay, back into the arguments. Before we go any further, the attendance password for today is twilight. Twilight, as in the period between day and night, or your favorite vampire romance. Okay. Okay, the next argument that Aquinas proffers, number 4, is the argument from gradation, right? Gradation being grades of things, grades being more or less good, an A being better than a B, and a B being better than an F, for instance, right? Or, different cars, right? They're, a new Corvette, a 2020 Corvette is better in just about it, all things being equal, right? Forget the cost, right? But it's better than my 2013 Ford Focus, right? Not that my Focus isn't a great car, but a new Corvette is better, right? So we are surrounded by some things in the universe, and some of those things are better than other things, right? Now, is there a better car than the Corvette? Well, sure, better than a new Corvette is a new Lamborghini, right? And what's better than a new Lamborghini? Well, we can play this game for a while. Eventually, we will arrive at the best car ever, and then we can ask ourselves: the best car that's ever been made, is that the best car that could be made? And then, of course, people say, well, no. There could be better cars. There could be a car that just looks like a modern Ferrari, but also flies and gets infinity miles to the gallon, and so on and so forth, right? We just can't invent that yet, right? So now we're thinking about not just better and better cars, but we're also thinking about the ways that a car, or anything else, I'm just using cars as an example, we're thinking about ways that a car could be better than it is, right? And Aquinas, and here he is borrowing from other philosophers, in particular Plato, the Greek philosopher. Aquinas wants to know, well, how is it that we say that one thing is better than another thing, and better than another thing still? And even when we come to the best thing that there is, the best soup that there is, the best car that there is, the best bottle of wine that there is, how do we then think to ourselves, well, that's the best that there is, but it could even be better, hypothetically, right? With regard to what? Could the best thing that exists, that the best, soup, with regards to what could be even better than it is? And Aquinas thinks this is only possible, grading things as better, this is better than that, and this other thing is better than that second thing even, and so on and so forth. Grading things like this is only possible if we have access, in some sense, to perfection. We have in mind the ability to grasp some kind of perfection, right? And it is against this standard of perfection that we compare things. Cars, soup, TV shows, everything. We compare it to this sense of perfection that we have, right? And this ultimate sense of perfection. And Aquinas says, well, this ultimate perfection then must be real, right? I mean, if it's influencing how we grade things, how we judge things, then it must be real. And this ultimate perfection, of course, is God, right? So the argument from gradation is as follows. Some things are more or less good. These things are only more or less good in relation to perfection. Therefore, that line means therefore. Therefore, perfection exists, and this perfection is God. What do we want to say about that? I don't want to say much about it. It's pretty straightforwardly stealing from Plato. Also, whether or not this is a judgment about things that we see rather than a judgment of judgment itself is an open question. So yeah, this one's not terribly convincing. Maybe the other ones weren't terribly convincing either, or if they were convincing, they weren't necessarily convincing of there being a God in any biblical sense. So Aquinas, he said he was going to give us 5 arguments to believe that God, 5 ways to know that God exists. And 1 through 4 seem to be, I don't know, not terribly convincing maybe. Or maybe, some of them might be, but some of them also there might be some redundancy here, right? People point out. Even if you believe 1 through 4, is it going to get you to church? Is it going to get you to go to church if you don't? Probably not. It might get you to think about, sort of the nature of what these arguments are concluding. But it doesn't necessarily get you reading the Bible, right? Okay. Now we're going to get to, though, the good one. Now we're going to get to the one that does convince people. Even people who reject this argument, think this argument doesn't work, they think the 5th argument is the best of these arguments, and it is the one that really requires explanation, right? And that is the very famous argument from design. So the 5th argument is the argument from design, and this is the one that you should pay the most attention to. This is the one that's going to, that Dawkins in our next lecture is going to both praise and then criticize, right? The argument from design goes this way. We are going to begin with an observation about the world around us. And that observation is that, boy, doesn't it seem like most things in nature, they seem to be behaving in a certain way. Seems like they're trying to accomplish some goal, right? Or they seem to be specially designed for some purpose, right? Fish live in the ocean, and they have gills, right? The gills allow them to breathe underwater, and their fins allow them to move through water, right? If they were really hairy and had big tusks, they wouldn't move as well through water. But it just so happens that they live in the water, and they have fins and gills that allow them to get around the water. Coincidence? No, it seems like the fish is designed to be in the ocean. At the same time, the giraffe has a really long neck, right? And the giraffe really likes the leaves at the tops of trees. Coincidence? Well, no. It seems like the giraffe is built to get at the leaves that other mammals aren't tall enough to get to, right? We can go down inside the organism, right? Look inside you right now. There's all these complicated systems going on, all these complicated biomechanical systems. Your heart is beating to move your blood around your body. Your liver and your kidneys are cleaning your blood, and so on. Your brain is zooming around up in your head. All of these systems are coming together to create you, right? They are moving with this machine-like precision. They seem to be crafted to create you, right? We don't even have to, and let's go even further down. Let's go down to the cellular level. If you look inside the human cell, there are all these little structures that allow the cell to replicate itself and get rid of waste and take care of all of these really complicated little jobs, right? So what's the deal? Acting toward, it really seems like all the organs in your body and your brain are really working together to create you, right? How is it they're smart enough to all work together to pitch in to create you? Well, they're not. Your liver isn't intelligent. Mine certainly isn't. Your heart doesn't know anything about pumping blood. Your stomach doesn't know anything about digestion. They don't have cognitive states. They don't have mental states. They're just like little machines, right? Well, if they're little machines, who's the machiner? Who designed them? Aquinas says, well, the answer ought to be obvious, right? The being that designed all of this is God, right? And the evidence of God's existence is in the careful craftsmanship that we see in nature. For Aquinas, there's no other explanation for how everything in nature is just so, right? There has to be an intelligence, and an intelligent designer, and this intelligent designer is God. So, to break this down, the argument from design: many things in nature act towards ends, which is to say they have a purpose. Your heart has the purpose of pumping blood around your body. The bird's wings have the purpose, and the bird's light bones have the purpose of allowing the bird to fly, and so on. Acting towards ends, that is, acting towards having a purpose, is a sign of intelligence. Natural systems are not themselves intelligent. Your heart isn't intelligent. The bird's wings aren't intelligent. Therefore, natural systems, so where does the intelligence come from? Well, the idea here is that the intelligence comes from the designer, right? That if I design a machine, the machine is not itself intelligent. Your car is not intelligent, but your car is a sign of intelligence. It's a sign of the intelligence of the people who put it together, right? And the idea here is that, well, look at natural systems. They are just as clearly designed as your car is. So natural systems must have been designed by some intelligence. This is God, says Aquinas. Now this is a good one, right? Now that's the kind of thing that gets you to church on time on Sunday, right? Even people who think this argument doesn't work, like Dawkins, think that this is by far the best reason to believe in God. Not only does this get you to believe in God, but it also gets you to believe in something like the kind of God that we're talking about on Sunday mornings, right? A God who designs the universe and cares enough about the universe and cares enough about you to design all of your organs and make them just so, it seems reasonable, is the kind of God that has a personality and that actually cares about the things that he's creating and maybe and creates those things for some loftier purpose, right? So of course, this argument from design is not necessarily an argument for the God of the Christian Bible, right? I mean, we could use this argument to, it's compatible with various other versions of God, right? But boy, this seems a lot closer to the mark than the conclusions of the previous arguments in terms of like getting us to the Christian version of God, right? So this is, by all accounts, I'll speak for you, this is the most convincing argument that Aquinas proffers for the existence of God. Does it work? Does it still work? Is it still reasonable to think that this argument proves that God must exist? We're going to look at next is Richard Dawkins is going to explain to us why no. While it might have been reasonable to accept the argument from design back in Aquinas' time, people in the modern era, people today, should know better. They should know better because of the theory of evolution. And he's going to, in the next lecture, explain why it is the theory of evolution, he thinks, proves that the argument from design is not convincing. So before I wrap up, let me just say as a kind of final thought on all of this, that often in this lecture, a lot of people are a little antsy, right? They are kind of bored by this topic. And I think particularly people who believe in God are a little bit bored by Aquinas' five arguments. Because it's widely accepted among modern believers, and modern Christians especially, that, well, you can't prove logically that God exists. It requires faith, right? And so there are a lot of people who just, even and especially people who are already on Aquinas' side generally, think that this is all sort of quaint and kind of an exercise in futility, right? I just want to note, well, first of all, if you were, excessively bored by this particular topic, I'm sorry. I do my best to liven it up a little bit with the quantum physics and so on, right? But also I want to point out, just as a historical note, about religion and philosophy, that it's a very, very new idea, relatively speaking. It's a very new idea, the idea that you can't prove that God exists. You just have to take it on faith, right? That's an idea that doesn't really gain a lot of traction. I mean, granted, there is biblical basis for that belief, right? But intellectually, in the traditions of philosophy and in the traditions of religion, of the various religions, that is not an idea that is really accepted or emphasized by anyone until about the 19th century, right? The mid-1800s, right? And I'm talking the idea that you can't prove that God exists; you just have to take it on faith. That's a relatively new idea, and so these arguments for the existence of God, they might be quaint from 2020. From the perspective of 2020, but it wasn't so long ago. These arguments were taken very, very seriously by people both in the church and both outside the church and inside the church, right? And not just the church, not just the Catholic Church, but the Christian religion in general, right? So just an interesting. Hopefully an interesting little footnote. So, okay, so next up we are going to talk about Richard Dawkins. So see you next time.